History, as a field of study, is an old one. The idea of understanding what came before and why it happened is not something that started in the last 100 years or something. Indeed, over 2,500 years ago, we had Herodotus. Conventionally considered the father of history, which is more or less accurate, Herodotus even provided the term history to us when he, like so many Greek thinkers, took a simple term and applied it to his book, naming a whole field of study for us in the modern era. Aristotle, in particular, is famous for this, with, for example, his books Politics, Physics, and Metaphysics. Herodotus used the term histori, which more or less means researches, because he was accounting the researches he'd made about the history of the places and peoples he spoke of in the work. Herodotus got a great many things right, as far as our modern history and archaeology can tell, and while it's true that he got things wrong too, he's often our best and sometimes our only source for large chunks of ancient history, such as the rise of the Persian Empire, its battles with the Greeks, the creation of Athenian democracy, the Median Empire, the creation of the unique social order of Sparta, and so on. Because of that, he's nearly impossible to avoid when considering ancient Greece and the ancient Near East. There are a few problems when it comes to actually reading Herodotus, however. For one, his material can be quite dense, and is often laden with speeches, and sometimes dialogue and side stories that have little to do with the main story at hand. He has a tendency to go back and discuss the history of whatever new player, be it a person, state, or people, that enters the narrative before coming back to whatever he'd been discussing before. His biggest example of this is when he changes tack completely as the Persians are marching towards Egypt to tell us the entire history of Egypt, as he knows it, up until the point the Persians are marching towards it. This habit of his can make it difficult to read him. What makes it more difficult for a modern audience, however, is that Herodotus was writing for an audience of the educated Greeks of his time. So he makes references and uses terminology and makes comparisons that his contemporary audience would have understood, but that don't mean much to us today. My copy of Herodotus in translation has 58 pages of endnotes, and while many of them are rather long endnotes, that's still a lot of endnotes. Many of these notes provide the kind of context that his original audience already had. Believe me, when you're trying to read Herodotus, it's not easy. It's dense, he can ramble, he goes back and talks about all kinds of other things before coming back to the main narrative, and you have to go back to the end of the book to get the endnotes so you have the context you need to understand what he's saying. It's a slow, sometimes even slogging process, and this is coming from a man who loves history. But even with all that, and putting to the side the significant historical merits of Herodotus, the histories are an extremely interesting story. It's the story of the rise and fall of empires, of great projects, both in peace and in war. It's the story of individual people. It's the story of people being crushed under the momentum of history, the story of people standing up to that momentum and changing its course. It's the story of the creation of the world's first democracy. It's the story of wise people and the story of people with enough hubris to astonish the reader. It's a human story. It's a story that is driven more by human action than by the will of the divine, or by impersonal forces or nature. Humans of all cultures, of all statuses, of all outlooks, shape the course of events. The histories are an accounting of what happened in the past, and they're a story, with a narrative and themes. The fact that it is a story as well as a history is critical to understanding the work, and it is why the work is so entertaining, for all it is dense and rambling and sometimes requires a certain amount of context to understand. To showcase what I'm talking about, both how interesting and how sometimes slogging his story can be, let's consider some actual text from Book 1 of the Histories. Croesus of Lydia, son of Alyattes, was tyrant of all the peoples to the west of the river Halys, which runs northward into the Black Sea and forms the boundary between Cappadocia and Paphlagonia. He was the first foreigner, so far as we know, to come into direct contact with the Greeks, both in the way of conquest and alliance, forcing tribute from Ionians, Aeolians, and Asiatic Dorians, and forming a pact of friendship with the Lacedaemonians. Before Croesus' time, all the Greeks had been free, for the earlier Cimmerian attack on Ionia was not a conquest, but a mere plundering raid. The sovereignty of Lydia, which had belonged to the Heraclids, passed into the family of Croesus, the Myrmidai, in the following way. Candaules, king of Sardis, the Greeks call him Myrsilus, was descended from Alcaeus, son of Heracles. His father was Myrsus, and he was the last of the Heraclids to reign at Sardis, the first being Agron, son of Ninus, grandson of Belus, and great-grandson of Alcaeus. Before the time of Agron, the reigning house had been the family of Lytus, son of Attis, hence the name Lydian, the people being previously known as the Maeonians. These princes turned over management of affairs to the Heraclids, the descendants of Heracles, and a slave girl belonging to Dardanus. The Heraclids later had their power confirmed by an oracle. They reigned for 22 generations, a period in all of 505 years, son succeeding father right down into the line to Candales, son of Myrsus. Now Candales conceived a passion for his own wife, and thought she was the most beautiful woman on earth. So having in his bodyguard a man he particularly liked, whose name was Gyges, son of Dasculus, Candales not only discussed his most important business with him, but even used him to make him listen to eulogies of his wife's beauty. One day the king, who was doomed to a bad end, said to Gyges, "It appears you don't believe me when I tell you how lovely my wife is. Well, a man always believes his eyes better than his ears. So do as I tell you. Contrive to see her naked." Gyges gave a cry of horror. "Master," he said, "what an improper suggestion! Do you tell me to look at the queen when she has no clothes on? No, no. When she takes off her clothing, she does away with her shame. You know what they say of women. Let us learn from experience. Right and wrong were distinguished long ago, and I'll tell you one thing that is right. A man should mind his own business. I do not doubt that your wife is the most beautiful of women, so for goodness sake, do not ask me to behave contrary to custom." Thus he did his utmost to decline the king's invitation, because he was afraid of what might happen if he accepted it. The king, however, told him not to distress himself. "There is nothing to be afraid of," he said, "either from me or my wife. I am not laying a trap for you, and as for her, I promise she will do you no harm. Look, I'll manage so she doesn't see you, doesn't know that you have seen her. I will hide you behind the open door of our bedroom. My wife will follow me into bed. Near the door there's a chair. She will put her clothes on it as she takes them off, one by one. You will be able to watch her with perfect ease. Then, while she's walking away from the chair towards the bed, with her back toward you, you slip away through the door, and mind she doesn't catch you." Gyges, since he was unable to avoid it, consented, and when bedtime came, Candales brought him to the room. Presently, the queen arrived, and Gyges watched her walk in and put her clothes on the chair. Then, just as she turned her back and was going to bed, he slipped softly out of the room. But the queen had seen him. Once she realized what her husband had done, immediately. But she did not betray the shame she felt by screaming or even let it appear that she had noticed anything. Instead, she silently resolved to have her revenge. For with the Lydians, as with most barbarian races, it is thought highly indecent for even a man to be seen naked. For the moment, she kept her mouth shut and did nothing. But at dawn the next morning, she sent for Gyges after preparing the most trustworthy of her servants for what was to come. There was nothing unusual in his being asked to attend upon the queen, so Gyges answered the summons without any suspicion that she knew what had occurred on the previous night. "Gyges," she said, as soon as he presented himself, "there are two courses open to you, and you may take your choice between them. Kill Candales and seize the throne with me as your wife, or die yourself on the spot, so that you may never again let your blind obedience to the king tempt you to see what you have no right to see. One of you must die, either my husband, the author of this wicked plot, or you, who have outraged propriety by seeing me naked." For a time, Gyges was too much astonished to speak. At last, he found words and begged the queen not to force him to make such a difficult choice. But it was no good. He soon saw that he really was faced with the alternatives, either of murdering his master or of being murdered himself. He made the choice. To live. "Tell me," he said, "since you drive me against my will to kill the king, how shall we set upon it?" "We will attack him when he is asleep," was the answer, "and on the very spot where he showed me to you naked." All was made ready for the attempt. The queen would not let Gyges go or give him any chance of escaping the dilemma. Either Candales or he must die. Night came, and he followed her into the bedroom. She put a knife into his hand and hid him behind the same door as before. Then, when Candales was asleep, he crept from behind the door and struck. Thus Gyges usurped the throne and married the queen. This is the Gyges Archilochus of Paros mentions as contemporary in his satires. Later, he had his power confirmed by an oracle from Delphi. The Lydians, indignant at the murder of Candaules, were prepared to fight. However, they managed to agree with the supporters of Gyges that he should continue to reign if the oracle declared that he really was the king. If, on the other hand, the oracle should declare against him, he should restore the throne to the Heraclids. The answer of the oracle was in favor of Gyges, so his royal power was established. Nevertheless, the priestess of the shrine added that the Heraclids would have their revenge on Gyges in the 5th generation, a prophecy to which neither the Lydians nor their kings paid any attention, until it was actually fulfilled. This was the way in which the Myrmidai got rid of the Heraclids and assumed sovereign power. Gyges, as soon as he had made himself supreme, sent a number of presents to the shrine at Delphi. Indeed, most of the silver there came from him. In addition, he presented a vast number of vessels of gold of various kinds, the most noteworthy being 6 golden mixing bowls. These bowls weigh in all nearly 2,500 pounds and stand in the Corinthian treasury. Though, to speak strictly, it should not be called the public treasury of the Corinthians, but rather of Cypselus, son of Aetion. Gyges was the first foreigner we know of, after King Midas of Phrygia, son of Gordias, to dedicate offerings at Delphi. Midas presented the royal throne from which he used to give judgment. It stands with Gyges' bowls and is well worth seeing. The Delphians call all this treasure, which Gyges sent, the Gygean treasure, after the name of the donor. Once established in power, Gyges sent a military expedition against Miletus and Smyrna and captured the citadel of Colophon. That, however, being his only act of importance in a reign of 38 years, I will pass on without further comment and mention his son Ardys, who succeeded him. Now, just think about that story for a second. It sounds almost like it belongs in a soap opera. It seems unlikely on the face of it, but in many ways that's not really the point. If Herodotus is not simply making this up out of whole cloth, which is itself unlikely, then this is a story that would have circulated at the time when Herodotus was writing, how the dynasty would have eventually led to Croesus coming to power, possibly even the official narrative of the dynasty. But the historical merits aside again for the moment, we're still left with a fascinating story. The story of a man so obsessed with his wife's beauty that he broke all established custom and all but forced his friend to see her naked. The queen's reaction seems extreme to us, perhaps, but this is where we come upon one of Herodotus' many themes, the power of custom and the punishment for violating custom. Candaules violated custom grossly, and so did Gyges. One of them had to pay, and Gyges was forced to make a terrible choice. But he chose his own life, killed the king, and became ruler himself. Candaules suffered punishment, and now Gyges was married to the woman he had seen naked, and seeing one's own wife naked was not a bad thing. Another major theme that comes up here is the Oracle of Delphi, the role the Oracle plays in validating or not validating what has happened. In this case, should Gyges be the king? Is he rightly the king? It also provides us with some obvious foreshadowing, which his audience would have known. Lydia does not end well, and indeed, in 5 generations, Gyges' line will in turn suffer its own comeuppance. The power of prophecy, and more importantly, of ignored prophecy, is not new in Greek literature. It features in the Iliad and in any number of myths and stories we know from the Greeks. He was using a device and a trope his readers would have known, and one we can recognize ourselves. Readers of Plato's Republic might well recall a very different story of Gyges and how he came to power. I won't go into it here, but the very fact that Plato used a different story points to the kind of problems Herodotus would have had in putting his history together, and by the same token is itself an interesting phenomenon. I chose this passage because it is such an interesting story, because it touches on several important themes of Herodotus in a relatively short passage. It foreshadows the story to come and is the beginning of Herodotus. His narrative, fundamentally, was the clash between the Greeks and the Persians. The Greeks and the many peoples of Asia under the Persian banner. In searching for the root of that conflict, he comes to Croesus, for reasons that we will see going forward. In searching for the roots of Croesus, he comes to Gyges, and thus begin the histories. Herodotus has his dry parts. He has his dull parts. Indeed, Herodotus has many parts you just want to skip. over. But he also has a fascinating story followed by a fascinating story in his work. When learning history in a classroom and getting drowned by the names and dates and facts and figures and learning about how ruler X did thing Y in year Z, it's easy to imagine that these people were mere robots acting in history, winning battles and building monuments and making decrees. In reality, however, they were humans like you and me, and to paraphrase George Carlin, we humans are really interesting critters. If there's one thing humans are good at, it's doing really crazy things that make for really interesting stories. There are many good, constructive reasons to study history, but another reason is just because it's fun. History is full of these fun, crazy stories. You just have to be exposed to them.